On the morning of the 10th of November 1989, I was sitting at the breakfast table of my parents' kitchen in Adelaide, eating my 12 Weet-Bix. 12, seriously, I had a big appetite. The radio was on, as always, and we were listening to live coverage of thousands of East Germans pouring over the Berlin Wall into West Germany. It was desperately exciting. And then at one point, a rather breathless journalist began to speculate about the end of communism. Later that day, I asked my primary school teacher, "What's communism?" I was obviously going to become a political philosopher. Like the consummate pedagogue that she was, she took the question pretty seriously and started by painting a picture of the communist ideal. It sounded pretty good to me, a bit like an endless summer holiday. Sufficiently good for me to ask her, but then why are the Germans getting rid of it? To which her discouraging but wholly predictable response was, "Nick, it's a nice idea, but it's just not feasible." This is my earliest memory of encountering the device whereby we reject or try to get someone else to reject an idea, no matter how desirable or undesirable, on account of being just not feasible. I want you to think for a second about just how commonly you too encounter this device, the just not feasible device, as I like to call it. Eradicating poverty, reversing climate change, putting shark nets on all Australian suburban beaches, getting the kids to bed by 6 p.m. These are just some of the countless ideas that we reject and try to get others to reject for being just not feasible. A Google search for the locution "not feasible" reveals more than 8 million hits. And of course, that doesn't account for the private conversations that we have, and it doesn't account for what happens inside our own heads, and it doesn't account for when we use the just not feasible device by using other words. That's not realistic. That's not viable. I can't do that. That's not an option. I suggest to you that at some point in the last week, and probably in the last day, you will have encountered the just not feasible device in some shape or form. For it is utterly ubiquitous. In argument and in thought, in political and personal life, with respect to matters momentous and mundane. It's not hard to see why. After all, it's a powerful and valuable tool. It can help us to avoid wastage and potentially to avert catastrophe. Indeed, it might strike you as sufficiently commonsensical that no remotely sane and sensible person could dream of questioning it. And yet, that's exactly what I'm about to do. I want to try to persuade you that the sanguine attitude that you probably have to the just not feasible device is entirely unwarranted. Granted that there are real dangers from which the just not feasible device can help to protect us, there are also very real dangers associated with using the just not feasible device, dangers that are all too often ignored. So what are these dangers? I'm a philosopher, so the dangers that are of most interest to me are the ones that result from certain features of our feasibility judgments themselves. And I'd like to ask you to reflect with me about 4 of them in particular. Consider first the fact that our feasibility judgments can be self-fulfilling prophecies. An idea might be perfectly feasible so long as we judge it to be feasible or don't judge it to be infeasible, but infeasible insofar as we judge it to be infeasible. Let me tell you a story from my own life. On the 7th of July 2008, I was surfing on the New South Wales south coast and I broke my neck. I was completely on my own, a long way from shore, severely concussed and with life-threatening, multiple displaced, unstable fractures to my top 2 vertebrae. Somehow I made it to the shore. I honestly can't tell you what was going through my mind, but I figure that I must have thought at some level, I can make it. At the very least, I must not have thought I can't make it. Suppose that I had thought I can't make it. That's just not feasible. In that case, my judgment would have been a self-fulfilling prophecy, and I wouldn't be here today. So here is a first danger associated with using the just not feasible device. We may reject as infeasible an idea that is only infeasible insofar as and because we judge it to be infeasible. A second danger results from the fact that we often confuse what's feasible with other things. What's sufficiently likely, or what's not too costly, or what's not too difficult, and so on. Let's focus on what's sufficiently likely. So think about the idea of making pharmaceuticals free to those in the third world. This is widely rejected for being just not feasible. Why? Well, here's one reason. Many of us judge, alas, that it's virtually certain not to happen. And that might seem to mean that it's just not feasible. It's just not feasible in as much as and because it's virtually certain not to happen. That shouldn't sound outlandish to you. We make feasibility judgments in that way all the time. And yet, it involves a very serious confusion. It's just not true that something that is virtually certain not to happen is not feasible. It matters why it's virtually certain not to happen. So suppose that a child is drowning in a swimming pool while I'm sunning myself on the grass. Suppose that I'm a perfectly capable swimmer, such that if I were to try to save the child, then I'd easily succeed. But suppose that I'm virtually certain not to try, because being a selfish prat, I don't want to get chlorine on my new swimmers. If we equate what's feasible with what's sufficiently likely, we'll be forced to say that it's just not feasible for me to save the drowning child. So here is a second danger associated with using the just not feasible device. We may reject as infeasible an idea that is merely unlikely to happen because we're unlikely to try to make it happen. There's a third danger as well. This results from the fact that our feasibility judgments have a very complex internal structure that is very often hidden from view, at least in part. For one, when we judge that an idea is feasible or not feasible, we implicitly have in mind a certain temporal horizon within which the idea is to be brought about. Today, or this week, or this year, or this parliamentary term. For another, we implicitly have in mind certain ways of bringing about the idea and implicitly rule out certain others. Suppose that the only way to save a ship that's caught in a storm is to throw all the passengers overboard. Most of us judge that it's just not feasible to save the ship. That's because we're implicitly ruling out saving the ship by doing something so horrid. So now think about an idea that's a bit closer to home. Think about the idea, say, of a carbon neutral economy. This too is widely rejected for being just not feasible. How so? Well, on a charitable interpretation, what's going on is that we're judging that a carbon neutral economy isn't going to be brought about anytime soon, say within the next 5 years perhaps, and we judge that it's not feasible to bring it about without incurring certain costs, higher energy prices, perhaps higher taxes, higher transition costs of various kinds. Let's suppose that's correct. Clearly, it doesn't follow that we're entitled to reject the idea of a carbon neutral economy as such. At the most, we're entitled to reject the idea of a carbon neutral economy within a particular temporal horizon without incurring certain costs. So here is a third danger associated with using the just not feasible device. We may reject as infeasible an idea that is perfectly feasible within a broader temporal horizon and give a more permissive understanding of the ways in which it might be brought about. This brings me to a fourth and final danger. This one results from the fact that our feasibility judgments don't settle the question of what we ought to do. Infeasible ideas should not always necessarily be rejected as such. Think about the idea of eradicating extreme poverty. Let's grant that this really is infeasible. And let's grant that this means that it's not true that we ought to bring it about. It's not literally true that we ought to eradicate extreme poverty. Does this mean that we're entitled to reject the idea of eradicating extreme poverty altogether? Certainly not. There can be value in trying to eradicate extreme poverty. Doing so can motivate us and others. It can send very powerful signals. Extreme poverty is so important that I'm going to try to eradicate it, even though I realize that I have no prospects of success. There can be value in approximating this idea. And of course, there can be value in using it as a yardstick with respect to measure ourselves and our performance and to note just how far we're falling short. For ideals can be important and valuable, not just to what we ought to do, but concerning how things ought to be. So here is the fourth danger associated with using the just not feasible device. We may reject altogether an idea, even if it is really infeasible, that nonetheless has value and that should somehow be kept alive. I've been trying to persuade you that the just not feasible device comes with some serious dangers, and I trust you're all persuaded. But you might reasonably ask, what's the upshot? Am I saying that we should get rid of the just not feasible device? No. The just not feasible device can misfire, but so can any device. Social media can be and has been used to hatch terrorist plots. That doesn't mean that we should get rid of social media. Social media is also valuable in certain respects, and so is the just not feasible device. Am I at least saying that we should revise and reform the just not feasible device? Replace it with a new and improved model, as it were? Not necessarily. A number of my colleagues and I are in effect exploring that possibility. But it's worth bearing in mind that a more sophisticated device isn't necessarily going to be better for us as we actually are. After all, more sophisticated devices can go wrong in more sophisticated ways. The upshot is simply this. The just not feasible device is not quite as straightforward and not quite as unproblematic as you might have thought. So next time when you find yourself tempted to use it, or when you notice someone else using it, pause, slow down. Remember that history is full of ideas that were mistakenly rejected for being just not feasible. Abolishing slavery, franchising women, introducing universal education. The consequences of these mistakes were not trivial. Above all, be open to the possibility that those ideas that are rejected in our own time for being just not feasible might be perfectly feasible after all. And even if they really are infeasible, be open to the possibility that they should be somehow kept alive rather than rejected altogether. For infeasible ideas can have value. They can be a reminder that the status quo is not inevitable. They can spur creativity, foster empathy, and pave the way for transformation.